The fourth and final types of verbs that share regular preterite tense endings are er and ir spelling change verbs. In the preterite tense, each of these verbs will receive a spelling change when conjugated. These verbs are accompanied by several rules, so be sure to take thorough notes and pay close attention. Let's get started. Just like regular verbs, AR spelling change verbs, and IR stem change verbs, these ER and IR spelling change verbs will also use regular preterite endings. And since these verbs are all ER and IR verbs, they will use regular preterite ER and IR endings. So let's review those endings now. Iste, io, imos, istes, ieron. And hopefully, by this point, you see the importance of reviewing your regular preterite tense endings frequently. Again, these endings will be used with ER and IR spelling change verbs in the preterite. These spelling changes that I have mentioned will affect verbs with stems ending in a vowel. These are ER and IR verbs with A, E, I, O, or U at the end of the stem. For example, let's take a look at the verb dormir, to sleep. First, we know that dormir ends in IR, so it is an IR verb. However, we can see that the stem of dormir is DORM. And since this stem ends in an M, it cannot be a spelling change verb because it ends in a consonant. However, let's take a look at the verb leer, to read. It's easy to see that leer is an ER verb, and its stem is LE. Since the stem of leer ends in a vowel, it will in fact receive a spelling change in the preterite tense. The specific ER and IR verb endings that will receive spelling changes in the preterite tense are AER, EER, like leer, OIR, OER, and UIR. It is important to note that verbs like traer, or verbs that have traer in them, are an exception to this rule. When conjugated, these verbs with double vowels in the ending will receive a spelling change from I to Y in the usted and ustedes forms only. All other forms of these verbs are regular. Let's take a look at an example of how we might conjugate an ER or IR spelling change verb in the preterite tense. We'll continue with the verb leer. In order to conjugate ER and IR spelling change verbs successfully, you need to follow these rules. First, drop the infinitive ending. In this case, it is the ER. And once you drop your infinitive ending, your stems should look like this. Your second step is to attach your regular preterite ER and IR endings to the stems. Once you have attached these endings, your nearly conjugated verb should look something like this. Lei, leíste, leyó, leímos, leísteis, leyeron. You may have noticed that the usted and ustedes forms of this verb sounded a little funny when I first pronounced them. That's because we haven't yet made the spelling change. Remember, in the preterit tense, verbs whose stem ends in a vowel and whose ending is er or ir will receive an I to y spelling change in usted and ustedes forms only. So, your third step in conjugating er and ir spelling change verbs in the preterit tense is to change your I to a y in both the usted and ustedes forms only. And here you can see that we've completed that third step. If you listen to the completed conjugations of the usted and ustedes form verb, leyó and leyeron, you can hear that it's a little easier to pronounce these verbs. Before, we had difficulty because there was an I between two vowels. And in Spanish, we know that any time an I is between two vowels, we change that I to a Y. And this is a little cheesy, but it might help you to remember that rule. When found between two vowels, I get shy and change to Y. When conjugating er and ir spelling change verbs in the preterit tense, we know that our first three rules are to 1. Drop the infinitive ending. 2. Attach regular preterit endings to the stem. And 3. Change the I in each ending to a Y in usted and ustedes forms only. Our fourth and final rule applies to only a few of our er and ir spelling change verbs. And it tells us that for all er and ir spelling change verbs, except for those ending in uir, you should add an accent to the first I in each ending. So we know that this rule will affect all forms of our spelling change verbs except for usted and ustedes. Now we're ready to finish conjugating our example verb, leer. Since leer does not end in uir, we will need to add an accent to the first I in each ending. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Here, you can see that I've added an accent to the first I in each ending. Remember, yo form already had an accent. And now we are finally finished conjugating leer in the preterit tense. And its pronunciation sounds like leí, leíste, leyó, leímos, leísteis, leyeron. I read, you read, he, she, it, or you read, we read, y'all read, or they read, or you all read. Here's another completed example of a conjugated er and ir spelling change verb. Since this verb, creer, to think or believe, ends in er, and has a stem that ends in an E, we automatically know that this will be a spelling change in the preterit tense. So first, we drop the ER, and then we attach our regular preterit ER and IR endings. Then, you should change the I to a Y in usted and ustedes forms. Finally, since creer does not end in UIR, you need to add an I accent in each form, except for usted and ustedes. When fully conjugated in the preterite tense, creer sounds like this. Creí, creíste, creyó, creímos, creísteis, creyeron. I thought, you thought, he, she, it, or you thought, we thought, y'all thought, they thought, or you all thought. So let's wrap up with a look at a UIR verb and its conjugations in the preterite tense. Our verb, huir, ends in ir and has a stem that ends in a vowel or a u. So we know that in the preterite tense, this will receive a spelling change. Our first step is to drop our ir infinitive ending. And then we will attach our regular preterite er and ir endings to the stem. Our third step is to change the I to a Y in our usted and ustedes forms only. Since this verb ends in UIR, we have now completed our conjugation of this verb. Remember, because it ends in UIR, we do not need to add additional accents. We simply keep the accents we already had. And the pronunciation of this verb in the preterite tense sounds like this. Ui, uiste, huyó, huimos, huisteis, huyeron. And our verb means to flee. So in the preterite, it will mean I fled, you fled, he, she, it, or you fled, we fled, y'all fled, they fled. Hopefully, this isn't a verb you have to use too frequently. This concludes our fourth video in this series of preterite tense notes. These er and ir spelling change verbs were the last type of verbs that will use regular preterite endings. So remember that from here on out, we'll be talking about irregular verbs. If you need additional practice, check Edmodo for my Prezi, practice activities, and more class notes. And don't forget to study for your upcoming quiz. Good luck!